June 71 CE. You are standing in a corridor that no longer belongs to you. The war has ended, but nothing here feels finished. Stone walls hold the cold of the night. Somewhere beyond them, footsteps echo, not hurried, not loud, measured, administrative. You are not bound, not touched, not spoken to, and that silence is deliberate. It tells you that what happens next has already been decided, written down, approved, and filed. You are the wife of a defeated enemy. You hear a door close behind you, not with force, but with certainty. Torches flicker, then steady. You are not afraid of death. Death would be simple, final. What waits instead is continuation, a future controlled by others, a life redesigned without your consent. And as the sound fades, you understand something clearly. Death would have been easier than what followed. This moment did not happen once, or in one empire, or to one woman. It repeated itself across centuries, across continents, across banners raised and lowered in victory. When empires defeated their enemies, the battlefield was only the beginning. After treaties were signed and soldiers dismissed, another system quietly activated.
One that dealt not with land or gold, but with people, specifically with the wives of those who had lost. This was not random cruelty, it was policy. Empires understood that conquest did not end with armies, it ended with control, and control required more than occupation. It required leverage. Enemy wives became that leverage, symbols of submission, tools of negotiation, and instruments of deterrence. Their fate was discussed not in moments of rage, but in councils, offices, and private chambers, where language was careful and intentions were clear. Records from Rome describe them as transferred.
Persian sources refer to them as retained. Chinese dynastic annals note them as relocated households. These words were chosen to remove emotion, to turn human lives into manageable categories. What happened to these women was not improvised. It followed procedures. Lists were made. Status was evaluated. Decisions were justified as necessary for stability. This wasn't chaos. It was organization. In the Roman Empire, defeated generals' wives were often removed from public life entirely. Some were sent to distant estates. Others were absorbed into imperial households under strict supervision.
Officially, this was protection. Unofficially, it was erasure. Their names faded from inscriptions. Their voices disappeared from correspondence. They were not executed because execution created martyrs. They were preserved quietly because preservation allowed control. In Han China, enemy wives were registered as state dependents, their movements restricted, their futures reassigned. They lived under watch, not chains. Surveillance replaced violence. Compliance was ensured through uncertainty. They were never told how long this would last. Indefinite was the point.
In the Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian worlds, wives of defeated kings were relocated to palace compounds, not imprisoned, but contained. Their presence served as proof of victory. Their survival was conditional. They were reminders, visible to those in power, invisible to history. What they endured rarely appears in detail, not because it was insignificant, but because it was deliberately undocumented. Empires recorded what they were proud of: battles, laws, monuments. What happened behind closed doors was handled through silence. That silence was part of the system.
If you listen closely to what isn't written down, a pattern emerges. These women were not punished for crimes. They were punished for proximity. Their value lay in who they were connected to. By controlling them, empires controlled memory, lineage, and potential resistance. A defeated man could be executed. A defeated ideology could be banned. But a defeated family required management. So the wives were managed. They were isolated from their networks. Their titles were stripped, then sometimes partially restored under new terms. They were given allowances that could be revoked.
Their children, if any, were placed under supervision or separated entirely. This was not always framed as cruelty. It was framed as order, and order was the empire's highest virtue. What history records is that these women disappeared from public view. What it does not teach is that disappearance was intentional. Removal from visibility was a form of punishment that left no blood, no scandal, no resistance. Silence replaced spectacle. By the medieval period, the pattern had matured. In the aftermath of crusades and dynastic wars, enemy wives were often reassigned as diplomatic assets. Some were forced into religious institutions. Others were compelled to remarry under terms that benefited the victor. Official documents describe these transitions as resolutions. The language implies closure, but for the women involved, there was none. They lived with uncertainty as a permanent condition. In the Mongol Empire, enemy wives were catalogued as part of the spoils of conquest, but managed with precision. They were redistributed within the imperial network, not randomly, but according to rank and political usefulness. Their treatment depended less on personal behavior and more on strategic value. Fear was not enforced through constant punishment, but through the awareness that they were always being assessed. Across these empires, the method remained consistent. Remove agency, maintain ambiguity, enforce dependency. This is where modern audiences often misunderstand the past. They imagine cruelty as impulsive, loud, and visible. But imperial cruelty was quiet. It worked best when it appeared reasonable, when it could be justified as tradition, necessity, or law. What happened to enemy wives after wars ended was rarely debated publicly. It didn't need to be. The outcome was already normalized. This is why their stories survive only in fragments, letters that stop abruptly, names that vanish from genealogies, references that shift from specific to vague. A woman who was once identified clearly becomes the widow, then a former consort, then nothing at all. Not erased by time, but by design. There are moments, however, where the silence breaks. Consider Cornelia, wife of a Roman provincial leader who sided against the Senate during a civil conflict. After her husband's defeat, Cornelia was not executed, not exiled officially, not publicly condemned.
She was relocated to a villa outside Rome, placed under the supervision of a minor official, and forbidden from correspondence. Her name appears once more in a household inventory. Then, never again. What she felt, what choices she faced, what she endured behind closed doors, history does not say. But the structure that confined her is clearly visible. She was kept alive, managed, and removed from relevance. Or take Lady Zhao of the late Han period, married to a regional warlord who refused imperial authority. After his defeat, she was brought to the capital.
Court records state she was treated with consideration. That phrase appears repeatedly in Chinese bureaucratic language.
It does not mean kindness. It means compliance was achieved without open conflict. She was never allowed to leave. These women did not resist loudly. They couldn't. Resistance had been engineered out of their situation. Every option led to the same outcome: survival on someone else's terms. Silence was not weakness, it was strategy. If this kind of history matters, if examining how power operates after the fighting stops matters, then following dark inquest history is not about entertainment.
It is about refusing to let these systems remain invisible. Because what they don't teach is often more important than what they celebrate. As the empire stabilized, these women became part of the background machinery. They were used to legitimize new rulers, to neutralize old claims, to reassure populations that order had been restored. Their personal suffering was irrelevant to the state. Their usefulness was everything. And when their usefulness ended, they faded. No trial, no announcement, just absence. This absence shaped how later generations understood victory.
Conquest appeared clean. Peace appeared merciful. The cost was hidden in households no one visited and records no one quoted. You are still standing in that corridor. Time has passed. The war is over. The empire is secure. And your life continues, not as you chose it, but as it has been assigned. You will not be remembered as a casualty of war. You will be remembered, if at all, as a footnote, an unnamed presence whose silence made order possible. And this was only the beginning. As the years passed, the system refined itself. Empires learned that fear did not need to be renewed constantly. Once established, it maintained itself. Enemy wives were absorbed into structures designed to appear stable, even generous. They were given rooms instead of cells, schedules instead of restraints, supervisors instead of guards. Everything was arranged to suggest order rather than punishment. And that suggestion mattered, because when punishment looks like administration, it becomes invisible. In imperial capitals, these women were rarely spoken of directly. They existed inside corridors of power, present yet unacknowledged. Officials referred to them through neutral titles: dependents, residents, protected persons. Each label reduced a life into a manageable concept. Each term allowed those in charge to distance themselves from consequence. What wasn't written down was how uncertainty functioned as control. Not knowing what would happen tomorrow, not knowing whether a small privilege would remain, not knowing if a word spoken too freely would reach the wrong ear. This constant waiting shaped behavior more effectively than force ever could. It taught restraint. It taught silence. In the Abbasid Caliphate, wives of defeated rivals were often kept within palace-adjacent quarters.
They were not displayed, but they were not forgotten. Their continued existence served as a reminder to other elites. Submission ensured survival, but survival came with conditions. Their names were recorded in financial registers, allocations of food, clothing, attendance. Everything measurable, nothing human. In Byzantium, enemy noblewomen were frequently confined to convents, not always as acts of faith, but as acts of policy. The religious setting provided moral cover. Once inside, these women ceased to be political actors. Their vows were often assumed, sometimes imposed.
Their voices were contained behind walls that society already considered appropriate. What appeared merciful was often final. Across medieval Europe, the pattern repeated. After dynastic conflicts, wives of defeated lords were placed under protection by victorious houses. They lived under supervision,
their movements negotiated, their futures determined through legal instruments they never signed. Marriage contracts were annulled or reinterpreted. Property rights were reassigned. Identity itself became unstable. They learned quickly that nothing was permanent, not safety, not status, not memory. What history records is that these women survived. What it does not explain is the cost of that survival. Survival meant compliance with expectations that were never clearly stated. It meant adapting to roles that could change without warning. It meant living as evidence, proof that resistance had failed, that the empire had absorbed all opposition. Some were used as symbols of reconciliation. Public appearances were staged carefully. Their presence suggested unity, continuity, and peace. But behind those appearances lay a deeper truth. Their bodies were present, but their agency was gone. Others were kept deliberately unseen. Their disappearance was itself a message. If even those closest to defeated power could be erased without trace, then anyone could. This was how empires taught lessons without speeches. There are moments where individual stories surface briefly, enough to reveal the shape of the system. Consider Helena of Epirus, connected to a Hellenistic ruler defeated during Rome's eastern expansions. After her husband's fall, Roman records state she was received honorably. That phrase appears flattering, but her subsequent absence from political life tells another story.
She was removed from her court, separated from her allies, and placed under Roman oversight. Her children were educated under Roman supervision. Her lineage was absorbed. Honor, in this context, meant containment. Or Shajar al-Durr, whose brief rise to authority in the Islamic world ended after conflict and political realignment. Once power shifted, her fate was decided quietly. Chronicles become vague. Responsibility is diffused. The system closed around her, and history moved on. What remains consistent is not the cultural context, but the logic. Empires feared unresolved loyalty. Enemy wives represented unresolved narratives, connections to the past that could not be fully erased without creating instability. So instead of destruction, empires chose management. Management was safer. This is where the cruelty deepens, not through intensity, but through duration. These women lived for years, sometimes decades, inside conditions that denied closure. They were neither punished fully nor restored. They existed in suspension. And suspension changes people. Silence becomes habit. Waiting becomes identity. Self-censorship becomes instinct.
Over time, the system no longer needs to enforce itself. The individual enforces it internally. That is the moment empires aimed for. Halfway through this history, it becomes clear that these stories are not anomalies. They are patterns, and patterns only persist when they are useful. If continuing to uncover how these systems worked, how authority reshaped lives after wars officially ended, matters to you, then staying with dark inquest history is a shared responsibility. Not to sensationalize the past, but to refuse the comfort of incomplete narratives.
Because what wasn't written down shaped generations. Children raised in these controlled households learned restraint early. They learned which questions were dangerous. They learned which histories were better left unspoken. In this way, the punishment extended beyond the original target. It reached forward, quietly, into the future. Empires understood this generational effect well. In Qing China, wives of rebel leaders were often integrated into banner households. Officially, this was assimilation. In practice, it was surveillance. Their children were educated in imperial loyalty.
Their ancestral ties were diluted. Memory was redirected. In the Ottoman world, enemy wives were sometimes absorbed into extended palace systems. Not all experienced the same fate, but all shared one condition: dependency. Their status could rise or fall without explanation. Favor was unpredictable. Stability was conditional. And conditionally granted stability is a powerful tool. These women learned to read rooms carefully, to speak cautiously, to exist without drawing attention. They survived by becoming invisible, even to themselves. What history records is the empire's success, the absence of rebellion, the appearance of peace.
What it does not record is the emotional labor required to sustain that peace. The waiting, the uncertainty, the quiet calculations made every day just to endure. At times, a single object carries the weight of what cannot be said. A seal ring no longer worn, a letter never sent, a title no longer used. These small absences mark the boundary between who these women were and who they were allowed to become. And then, gradually, even those markers disappear. Their stories are not lost because sources are scarce. They are lost because the system functioned as intended.
Silence was the outcome. By the time later historians arrive, the records are clean, administrative, neutral. They describe outcomes without describing costs. They list names without lives. They record transitions without trauma. This creates a dangerous illusion that conquest ended cleanly, that order restored itself naturally, that suffering was minimal or justified. But order does not emerge on its own. It is constructed, and its construction always leaves traces, if you know where to look. You are no longer in the corridor. Years have passed. The war that defined your fate is now a paragraph in a chronicle.
The empire has moved on to new conflicts, new enemies, new systems of control. But you remain, living inside a decision made long ago. Your survival has become part of the architecture of power. And the most unsettling truth is this: the empire does not remember you because it does not need to. Your silence has already done its work. By the time history reaches its midpoint, the pattern is complete. Empires no longer need to invent new methods. They refine what already works. The wives of defeated enemies are no longer anomalies to be dealt with individually.
They are categories, entries, problems already solved by precedent. What changes is not the outcome, but the efficiency. These women begin to disappear, not only from power, but from narrative. Chroniclers mention their husbands at length, strategies, failures, betrayals, but reduce the wives to vague references. His household was settled. His family was accounted for. Appropriate measures were taken. Appropriate for whom is never explained. This absence is not accidental. It is protective. To describe too much would expose the mechanism. And empires protect mechanisms more carefully than borders.
In Safavid Persia, wives of defeated tribal leaders were often relocated to urban centers under the guise of court patronage. They lived among luxury that functioned as containment. Their isolation was softened by ceremony, their loss of autonomy hidden behind etiquette. In Mughal India, similar practices appeared. Enemy wives were sometimes brought into imperial households as dependents, not participants. Their former identities dissolved into titles that implied care but ensured obedience. They were watched closely, not because they posed immediate danger, but because memory itself was considered a threat.
Memory could revive loyalty. Memory could challenge legitimacy. So memory had to be managed. The most effective way to manage it was to surround these women with a future that left no room for the past. New routines, new names, new expectations. The old world was not forbidden, it was simply made unreachable. This is where the psychological weight becomes heaviest. These women were not allowed to mourn openly. Mourning acknowledged loss. Loss implied injustice. In many imperial systems, grief was regulated. Excessive displays were discouraged or quietly punished.
Composure was expected. Gratitude was encouraged. Gratitude for survival. Survival, however, came at a price that cannot be measured in records. Consider Rania of Cilicia, connected to a regional power crushed during Byzantine expansion. A single surviving letter references her adjustment to life in Constantinople. Adjustment is a neutral word. It hides the fact that she never returned home, that her language, customs, and authority were stripped away piece by piece, that her children were raised in a culture that treated their origin as irrelevant. Adjustment meant surrender without acknowledgement.
Or take Altani Khatun, tied to a Mongol rival faction, absorbed after internal conflict. Chronicles note that she was retained with honor. Again, the phrase appears. Again, the reality is unclear, but the structure is familiar. Retention meant usefulness. Honor meant control without scandal. These women lived inside contradictions. They were treated as valuable while being denied agency. They were preserved while being erased. The system required this tension, because the goal was not merely to neutralize enemies, it was to demonstrate permanence. Empires needed to show that defeat extended beyond the battlefield.
That it reshaped lives permanently, that nothing returned to its former state. Enemy wives embodied that message perfectly. They were living evidence that power reached into private life, that even the most intimate bonds could be reorganized by authority, that survival did not equal freedom. This message spread quietly. Other elites watched. They understood the implication. Resistance was not only dangerous, it was costly to those closest to you. This realization prevented future rebellion more effectively than any decree. And so, the women remained where they were placed.
Time passed. Generations shifted. Empires rose and fell. But the pattern persisted because it worked across cultures and systems. It adapted easily. Monarchies, caliphates, dynasties, and empires all found versions of it useful. What they shared was an understanding of power as something that extended beyond force. Power was narrative. Power was memory. Power was deciding whose suffering would be remembered and whose would be absorbed. The cruelty here is not loud. It does not announce itself. It settles in slowly, becoming indistinguishable from normality.
These women aged in controlled environments. Their youth passed under supervision. Their later years arrived without recognition. Some outlived the empires that confined them. Others vanished into records so thin that historians debate whether they existed at all. That debate itself is part of the outcome. If existence can be questioned, then injustice can be denied.
What history records are outcomes, stability, continuity, peace. What it does not record are the negotiations that happened inside the self, the daily calculations, the decisions not to speak.
The thoughts abandoned because they led nowhere. Silence, repeated long enough, becomes internal. There are rare moments when a gesture breaks through, a donation made quietly, a relic preserved, a line of poetry that hints at loss without naming it. These fragments suggest that endurance was not passive. It was active, deliberate, exhausting. Endurance required intelligence. These women learned how to survive systems designed to outlast them. They learned how to appear compliant without disappearing entirely. They learned how to protect what little remained of their identity without provoking attention.
This is not weakness. It is adaptation under constraint, and it is almost never celebrated. By the late imperial periods, the system had become so normalized that it barely required justification. New officials inherited procedures without questioning their origins. Traditions hardened. Policies disguised themselves as inevitability. This is how injustice becomes invisible, not by denial, but by repetition. The wives of defeated enemies no longer shocked anyone. Their fate was assumed, expected, boring even. And boredom is the final stage of erasure. When something no longer provokes reaction, it no longer requires explanation.
You are no longer an individual at this point in the story. You are a function. Your life demonstrates a lesson others are meant to learn. Your silence stabilizes a system. Your disappearance reassures authority. And the most unsettling truth is this: the empire considers this outcome humane. Because there was no execution, no public cruelty, no visible suffering, only adjustment, retention, settlement. Words that suggest order while hiding cost. As historians, we are trained to trust documents, to rely on what is recorded. But in stories like this, what matters most is what was never written down.
The absence is the evidence. The missing voices. The abrupt endings. The women who step out of the record not because they died, but because the system no longer needed to acknowledge them. They were not forgotten by accident. They were forgotten because forgetting was useful. And usefulness, in imperial logic, always outweighs justice. You are still here, years later, living a life shaped by a war that officially ended long ago. The empire has moved on. The banners have changed. The corridors are quieter now. But the silence remains. And it remains because it was built to last.
When the empires finally weakened, the women rarely reappeared. Their absence was so complete that collapse itself did not restore them. Regimes changed, capitals fell, new rulers rewrote laws and chronicles, but the lives absorbed by the old systems were not returned. They did not emerge from archives. They did not step back into public memory. Because systems that erase do not reverse themselves. In many cases, the documents that might have explained their fate were destroyed intentionally. In others, they were never created at all. Administrative efficiency had required minimal detail.
Enough to manage, not enough to remember. What survived were outcomes without explanations. Later historians encountered this silence and mistook it for consent. They assumed that because rebellion did not follow, acceptance must have occurred. That because records were calm, conditions must have been tolerable. That because names vanished quietly, suffering must have been minimal. This is one of history's most enduring errors. Compliance achieved under constraint is not agreement. Silence enforced through dependency is not peace. Survival inside a closed system is not freedom.
But empires relied on this misunderstanding. It allowed them to present themselves as orderly rather than coercive, benevolent rather than calculating, stable rather than controlling. And that image endured. Cultural memory adjusted accordingly. Stories of conquest focused on strategy and leadership. Defeat became a lesson for rulers, not families. The wives of the defeated were recast as irrelevant, their experiences framed as private matters outside the scope of history. Yet their removal shaped societies in lasting ways. Lineages were altered, claims disappeared. Traditions were broken quietly. Generations grew up without understanding why certain stories were never told, why some names were never mentioned, why entire branches of memory seemed to end without reason. This is how power outlives itself. Not through monuments, but through habits of forgetting. In some regions, oral histories preserved fragments, warnings passed down in coded language, stories softened to avoid danger. In others, even that failed. Silence became total. The system succeeded so completely that later generations could not imagine an alternative outcome. And that may be the darkest consequence of all. Not the suffering itself, but the way it trained societies to accept absence as normal. The wives of defeated enemies were not meant to be remembered as victims. They were meant to function as proof that resistance ended cleanly, proof that order had been restored, proof that power reached everywhere it needed to reach. Once that proof was established, memory became unnecessary. What remains for us now are gaps. Gaps where a life should be. Gaps where choices were narrowed until only endurance remained. Gaps where history speaks confidently about outcomes while remaining silent about costs. To examine those gaps is not to accuse the past with modern judgment. It is to understand how authority actually worked, how it sustained itself, how it shaped behavior without constant force, and how easily such systems can be repeated when their methods go unexamined. Because the most dangerous systems are not the ones remembered for brutality, but the ones remembered for stability. You stand at the end of this history, not with resolution, but with unease. The war is over.
The empire is secure, the records are tidy, and somewhere within those clean conclusions are lives that continued quietly under terms they never chose, until even their silence was no longer needed. That is the legacy. And if keeping that legacy visible matters, if refusing to let these women vanish a second time matters, then subscribing to dark inquest history is not a request, it is an act of remembrance, a way to ensure that what was buried in procedure and silence is brought back into view where it belongs. Because history does not only belong to those who won, it also belongs to those who survived, unseen.